And I'm so glad that we have a large group joining us this afternoon to hear a very engaging duo presenting on AHRQ's Practice Facilitation Handbook, a resource for new facilitators and their trainers. And Cindy Brach and Lyndee Knox will be co-presenting. And looking through their slides that they have thoughtfully prepared, I noticed that they had the term PF, of course, for practice facilitation. And given the importance of practice facilitation, it kind of reminded me as a kid as PF flyers. To have good form and posture and a strategy one can fly through research and quality improvement in a much more efficient manner. So these ladies are high energy, high thoughtful ideals, and so we look forward to hearing from them. Also, we look forward to hearing from you. Kristen is going to tell you how you can pose questions, which will be responded to later on in the presentation by Cindy and Lyndee. And also a second type of responses that Cindy and Lyndee are going to solicit from you are polling questions to help them gauge your level of interest in aspects of practice facilitation so that it can help drive their presentation to meet your needs. So that'll be distinct from the open-ended questions that they will respond to later on. And with that, Kristen, could you please provide us some guidance with respect to folks who want to articulate new questions that will be asked later on in the presentation?
Sure. I'll be happy to explain how to submit a question to today's presenters. So to submit a question, you can use the GoToWebinar control panel. Just type a question under the questions section and hit send, as shown in the screenshot on this slide. You may submit a question at any time throughout the presentation, and at the end of the presentation, Rebecca will read the questions out loud and our presenters will respond. So Rebecca, I'll turn it back over to you for introductions.
So we are just delighted to have, we have a bi-coastal presentation, Cindy Brach from AHRQ, and areas that they will discuss. And again, they are soliciting input from you of areas of interest so they can meet your needs. So Cindy's going to present the poll, and I really encourage you to be responsive to that. So I thank you all.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. As you see on your screen, we want to get to know a little bit about you before we launch into our presentations. So if you would be so kind as to click the button next to the statement that is most closely approximating your role or your position, so we get a little bit of a sense. And Tana, can you tell people what to click to actually submit their poll? Tana, are you there? Kristen?
Oh, yes. I think if you just select your response, then that should submit the question.
Okay, so the poll just disappeared off my screen, but I hope it's still on your screens. So the choices are, I work in a practice facilitation program, so that could be a facilitator or working in a research organization. So does it look like we have our responses in? Can we publish those responses?
I'd be happy to state what the responses are for you, Cindy.
That would be great.
Okay, so we have 80% voted, and then counts are coming up as we speak. So for the first category, 21% work in a practice facilitation program, 23% work in a care delivery setting, 8% work in a health plan or other payer organization, 32% work in a quality improvement organization, and 16% work in a research organization. So thank you all for responding.
Okay. Well, that really is going to help Lyndee and I thinking about delivering this presentation. And one more question, if you will indulge us. Have you published our second polling question?
Yes, we put it up just now.
Okay, great. So, so the responses, your choice of responses to the question, what is your interest in practice facilitation, are, I want to, 1, gain general familiarity with practice facilitation, 2, find out what skills a facilitator needs to have. 3, decide if my delivery system could benefit from facilitation. 4, get information on how to train practice facilitators. And 5, obtain information on how to start or run a practice facilitation program. And I'm sure you want to learn all of these things, but if you had to choose, just click one of those buttons and submit your results. And I'm seeing people still voting. Okay, we're going to close the poll. And so the largest group of you, we're still, there we go. Largest group of you want to gain a general familiarity with practice facilitation. The second largest group is interested in getting information on how to train practice facilitators. So Lyndee, that's a heads up that people really do want some diving deep into the training process. And then we have some both in the skills for facilitators, and that last question, obtain information on how to start or run a PF program. I want to alert you that this is not a webinar about our how-to guide, which is specifically on starting up and running a facilitation program. So we're mostly going to be talking about facilitators, what do they need to do their job, how do you train them, what does it look like. But we'll give you information on how to access the how-to guide at the end of our webinar today. So thank you all very much for participating. And now I am going to try. Do you guys want to give controls over to me? Am I published? Kristen?
I do not see Cindy's slides yet. Could you help us out?
Can you show my computer? And apologies for the technical difficulties, but when the slide comes up, you'll see lovely pictures of Lyndee and myself. She's the glamorous one on the right-hand side, and that's me on the left-hand side. We having any slides yet? Kristen or Tana?
No.
Do we have a Kristen or Tana?
This is Tana. Cindy, you're the presenter. I think you just need to share your screen.
I didn't get a share your screen button come up.
Okay, let me try that again.
Okay, we'll try that one more time, and if not, we'll have you guys run the slides. Not a problem. So, so I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview. There we go. Are you guys seeing me now? Hello? Is anybody seeing my screen?
Not yet.
All right, let's try that.
So folks have asked a question whether or not the PowerPoint will be available. We will be posting these in a couple of weeks on the PBRN website, and we do have everyone's email who participated, and we can send you that information once it's available.
Kristen and Tana, try one more time sending that to me. And
okay.
I'm going to, because something did pop up, but let's give it one more shot. So an overview of what we're going to be covering. First, a general introduction to practice facilitation for those of you who are totally new to the topic. Some background and orientation to the Practice Facilitation Handbook that we have created and is published on AHRQ's website. An overview of the practice facilitation process and do a little bit of a deep dive into the kickoff meeting, and looking at the core competencies that practice facilitators need to possess in order to do their jobs, and we'll be taking a little dive into that. All right. Now I'm no longer a presenter.
So we'll do the slides. We
have
them
okay.
up.
Yep. Go to the overview slide, please.
Thank you.
So, and then the final section, we're going to be talking a little bit about intervention-specific competencies. So things that practice facilitators have to have mastery over in order to implement a particular intervention. And we'll be talking more about what that means. So in the next slide, we're talking about what is practice facilitation. Well, practice facilitation is about building organizational capacity for practices to do continuous quality improvement. So it's really focusing on trying to get them to learn how to manage their data. I'm hearing some beepings on the line. Are other people hearing beepings on the line?
Yes.
Okay. If Christian, yep, it's saying 3 beeps. If we could troubleshoot that, that would be great because it's a little bit distracting. So up here we have a quote from Grace Flutitsis, who is someone who Lyndee works with, who's on her board at LANet. And she says it's self-management support for practices instead of patients. And so I think that really gives you the flavor of what facilitators are trying to achieve, which is giving the practices the tools to take care of it themselves. Next slide, please. So then you ask the question, why should we have practice facilitation? And the answer is multi-pronged, because quality improvement is very hard to achieve. You know, if we're talking about redesigning systems, it's very complex. And very often the expertise to manage change doesn't reside in the practice. Sometimes there are interventions that have been developed elsewhere, but they need tailoring to get them to work in your place. And finally, sometimes practice facilitation just gives you that focus that you need to make time to do the quality improvement work, which otherwise might get shunted aside because people are focused on the day-to-day work of treating patients. Next slide, please. So practice facilitation isn't a new idea. It's actually been around for 25 years. And there's a growing evidence base on its effectiveness. In fact, a 2012 meta-analysis of the research found that practices were 3 times more likely to adopt evidence-based guidelines than practices that didn't receive facilitation. We're also seeing an increased interest on practice facilitation because there are certain changes that there's wide consensus that we need to make in the delivery system. So improving chronic care, implementing patient-centered medical homes. And we, in fact, have a boost for doing those things with the implementation of healthcare reform. And that's also leading to a larger number of practice facilitation programs. And on the map on the next slide, you'll see that the facilitation programs are across the country. This map is a few years old, so it'll get updated later next year with a lot more little dots here. But we have programs around where people are now struggling with how do we actually train these facilitators. Next slide, please. So for those of you who don't, who are sort of still scratching your heads and saying, well, what is a practice facilitator? Practice facilitators are specially trained individuals who work with practices to make meaningful changes designed to improve patient outcomes. And that's a quote from Darren DeWalt, who does a lot of work in practice improvement out in North Carolina. Now, you may also ask, well, how does practice facilitation differ from consulting, for example? And one of the big differences is that practice facilitators develop long-term relationships with practices, that they are not just in for a few months, hand a solution over and then you don't see them anymore. This quote comes from Lyndee, who likes to say that she knows that a facilitator has really been accepted by the practice when they have the key or the combination to the back door, and that the fact that they can get in and out as needs arise really shows that they've developed that trusting long-term relationship that is sort of the hallmark of practice facilitation. Next slide, please. So what are the activities, the things that practice facilitators actually do? Well, a lot of it has to do with, developing that quality improvement capacity. So forming and training quality improvement teams, management of quality improvement projects, creating systems, and I emphasize systems for generating QA data. Practice facilitators are not an extra pair of hands to do the work. They're trying to help the practice develop that capacity. They also conduct assessments of the practice, facilitate meetings. They usually have their hands on a wide range of resources that they can pull in as the practice has a particular need. And they engage in executive coaching, so helping the leadership of the practice as well as the frontline folks. Next slide, please. Some other activities have to do with health information technology, which has been a huge stumbling point for many practices as they are trying to do quality improvement and manage the health of their populations. There's also deep technical assistance in particular interventions. So in this case, we gave the example of patient-centered medical home, where they might be helping the practice with developing team-based care, or managing their panels of patients, or coordinating care. They're also integrating across change efforts, and a lot of practices are doing multiple things at the same time, and everybody has got their own project and their own timetable, and that practice facilitator can really help them tie things together and make it make sense as a unit, rather than making them feel like they're being pulled in a million different directions. In some cases, and particularly in practice-based research networks, facilitators can deliver some research assistance in collecting data to help show the impact of their effort and the practice's changes. And finally, because facilitators are working in more than one practice, and facilitators are often in a program with other facilitators, they have an opportunity to identify what's working well and share that across practices. Next slide, please. So Lyndee and I, when we thought about this, we broke out the facilitation process into a set of stages, which are depicted here. And you start, as the left side shows, with building the relationship, and then you're doing the hands-on support and interactions with the practice, and finally you kind of go into a sustaining mode where you monitor and maintain and plan. So we divided this up into 6 different stages, starting out with the recruitment of a practice. So, does a practice want to have facilitation, and are they ready to receive facilitation? So it may be that a practice, thinks, oh yes, that would be helpful, but in fact, they are so distracted by other things, or, they're in a somewhat dysfunctional state that they really can't even be at the point of being able to benefit from facilitation. Or they might be, at such the top end that the area for improvement of the value added of a practice facilitator is limited. Then we have the beginning stage of facilitation with a kickoff meeting, You might bring in an academic detailer, which would be a clinician from another practice who's, successfully implemented or had the same goals and have gone through this process before, and start up that engagement process. And at one of the other beginning activities in stage 3 has to do with really deciding on what the goals are for this facilitation and doing a formal assessment of the practice, not of whether the practice is ready to have a benefit from a facilitator, but where do they stand in terms of achieving these goals, and what do they need to be working on, and what's working well and what isn't working well. And stage 4 is the active improvement phase, where they're collecting data, going through quality improvement cycles of trying, testing changes, and making adjustments. And when they have gotten to their goals, though, they can't become complacent. They actually have to do some work to really hold those gains and make sure that things don't slide. And at the final phase, there is a completion of the facilitation, a closeout, and setting things up so that we're in a position to maintain things. Next slide, please. So, so the next question Lyndee and I wanted to address, and we'll be addressing throughout, is what competencies do practice facilitators have to have in order to be able to function effectively? And so we've developed this diagram. In the center are the core competencies. These are the things, no matter what the topic of the facilitation is, that every facilitator need to have to master. Using and presenting data, using quality improvement methods, making quality improvement plans, benchmarking and clinical performance. All of these things, everyone would need to have. Then in the second ring, we have competencies that are related to a particular intervention. So there might be a particular guideline around, or a set of guidelines around heart care, health, or diabetes care that the practice is going to focus on. And so there are going to be specific competencies that the facilitator would need to have around that intervention. And then the final ring is the highly specialized processes, which not every facilitator is necessarily going to have, so that sometimes facilitators working teams where there will be sort of a generalist facilitator who's the #1 contact for the practice, but that person will bring in his or her colleagues depending on what the needs are. So that if there's a practice that's really interested, for example, in telemedicine, and that's going to help them achieve their goals, that facilitator may not be an expert in telemedicine, but he or she knows who is. Next. So how do the facilitators get these competencies? Well, when we looked around to see how practice facilitators are currently trained, we discovered that there's really no standardized approach. There's anything from a 2-day workshop and then, throw you in the deep end of the pool to a multi-year professional development course. We also found that the resources to train facilitators are scattered around. There are a lot of great resources, but they were all over the place. So anybody wanting to train facilitators had to run around and dig and find. And that largely, you had to depend on these informal exchanges with your colleagues who had facilitators to kind of find out, oh, you've developed something on this. I'd really like to use that with my facilitators. So can you go to the next slide, please? So we decided to create this practice facilitation handbook, which is basically a set of training modules. there's a sort of textbook part and then a trainer's guide. You'll see when we describe the modules that they use adult education methods, so the idea is not to just kind of lecture at people. And we developed this based on work that we had done, a project that Lyndee and I did together, where she was working on implementing the chronic care model in a group of community health centers in California. And so a lot of the intervention-specific materials in the handbook focused on that. And what it essentially does is it curates the best of what we found out there already existing, as well as what we learned ourselves when we were fortunate enough to have wonderful colleagues out in the field who were very generous in sharing the materials and letting us include them in the handbook. Next slide, please. So one of the things that led to the handbook development was that in 2010, Lyndee organized and ran what we called a practice facilitation consensus meeting. And next slide, please. And it brought together people from all over the country who were facilitators or ran facilitation programs, who hired facilitators, who used facilitators, who funded facilitators, who studied facilitators, so this great group of experts. And next slide, please. And then we also use the, next slide, please, the lived experience that we had from Lyndee's demonstration project, which was trying to implement a specific AHRQ toolkit on the chronic care model, the care model. Next slide, please. And we also really benefited from advisors. And Lyndee, tell me, did I miss anybody? I tried to highlight in red folks who I know you leaned on heavily in this process. Were there others on the advisory group? You got to unmute yourself for us to hear you.
And Lyndee, if we can't hear you, if you can press hashtag your audio pin and hashtag again. It looks like you can speak now.
I'm here.
Okay.
This is Lyndee.
Good. So did I catch everybody on this slide who was part of the advisory group with the red?
You did. I had to dial back in. I'm sorry.
Okay. Sorry about
I
that.
think we did.
All right. Well, we'll get back to you then. Let's go on to the next slide. So the purpose of the handbook was, there were actually several purposes, if we could get the next slide. So one was to give a just basic introduction to new facilitators, to say, you know, here's Practice Facilitation 101, what is it, what are the moving pieces, what do you need to know, etc. And so it can be used by the facilitators themselves, but it was really thought to want to provide some resources to people who were starting a practice facilitation program. And as I said before, to gather up all those resources that were out there. Next slide. So there are 21 training modules, and this is not, this handbook is not sort of the definitive curriculum, but this was what we decided was important to get out as our first foray into a more comprehensive approach to training facilitators. And the modules are designed in sort of chunk sizes so that they can be delivered, you know, during a lunch or an afternoon as an in-service training as well as an intensive for new facilitators. And there are 4 parts. So we'll be going. The first part is a lot of the stuff that I've been discussing with you already about basics about practice facilitation and the phases of facilitation. Next slide, please. And so in addition to sort of facilitators studying on their own and having an instructor stand up in front of a class and deliver the content, the content could also be delivered in a virtual classroom, or you could take pieces, take modules here and there and use that to augment an existing training program. So for each module, there are two main pieces. One's the trainer's guide, and the second is sort of the synthesis on that topic. Next slide. So here's a picture of the trainer's guide. No, wrong way. There we go. A picture of the trainer's guide that each module has instructions about how long will it take, what materials do you need, what are the objectives of this module. And then remember I talked about sort of adult learning techniques of we have actual exercises and activities, some to be done beforehand as preparation, some after, some ideas for the trainers on how to present, and suggestions of discussion questions that they can lead the group through. Next slide. So, having given you this sort of overview of the handbook, Lyndee's now going to talk about using the handbook with her PBRN at LANet.
Thank you very much, Cindy. That was a great introduction to this and overview of practice facilitation. So my role in this particular presentation is really to talk about almost the community perspective or the use of these materials. And so I'm going to talk about 3 different ways that we've been able to use this handbook. And the first way was with my organization. It's a practice-based research network that supports the safety net in Los Angeles. And we needed to create a practice facilitation workforce. It's really a new workforce that's emerging, even though it's an old idea. And so we use this handbook as a way to really launch our practice facilitation program and train our first set of practice facilitators. And because we were very new at it, the first thing that we did was also reach out to expert outside faculty. Specifically, we asked Jim Mould from Oklahoma, who really is the person that pioneered a lot of the practice facilitation work in the U.S., to come out and do a 2-day kickoff workshop for our new practice facilitators. And then we use the content in the handbook to continue to train the facilitators on a weekly basis. The facilitation process is complex and many skills, and so a one-shot training is not sufficient to keep these folks supported. And then in addition to the handbook materials to train them on a weekly basis, we also had best practice spread sessions. One of the magic ingredients of facilitators is they work a little bit like honeybees. They can pollinate great ideas across many practices. And so it's important during the training process that you give the facilitators time to talk about what they're seeing in the field and some potential promising or exemplar practices, and share those with each other for spread to other settings. The second way that we use this handbook was to, we've been doing a project with the Greater Los Angeles VA system, and they are in the process of launching internal, they call them coaches, internal coaches, within their system, supporting right now 9 of their sites and about 187 teamlets. And the VA system nationally already has some very nice training materials, what they call transformational coaching training, but there was a need for some more in-depth skills training with the ones in Los Angeles. And this was really using the handbook and its materials to cross-train staff that were already working in other areas and had other responsibilities. And so they were being given some protected time to also do coaching, but they had other either clinical or administrative duties within the organization. And then the third way we've used the handbook is really, again, with an eye to workforce development. We were able to get a university, in this case SUNY Buffalo, and their adult education college, Millard Fillmore, to use the handbook to launch a virtual certificate training program for facilitators. And part of why it worked well is it was easy for them because the curriculum was already well developed and resourced, and they were able to move it into an online format and provide virtual classes on a 12-week basis and offer the certificate. And we have now a university in Los Angeles that I have talking with Millard Fillmore about perhaps partnering with them and having students from this area also join, mainly for selfish reasons, because we really still need you know, a lot of workforce development, so I have enough facilitators to send out into the field. So Cindy, I think back to you. Cindy?
Okay, yeah, sorry, can we get the next slide, please? Thanks. So here's sort of a table of contents of part 2 that shows the core competencies. And you can see, you know, what I've been talking about in terms of specifics around quality improvement and data. And we're going to talk a little bit about Module 5, which is on mapping and redesigning workflow. Next slide, please. So the goals of mapping and redesigning workflow have to do with trying to improve performance and increase efficiency. So what one does is identify the important activities related to a certain process and map them out physically. And what you first try to do is map out what the reality is, as opposed to what people's perceptions are, which sometimes differ from reality and from each other, and then to identify an ideal process and how to go about achieving that. Next slide, please. So this is a picture from the handbook of a possible workflow map, and you can see it's actually fairly straightforward in terms of being linear. And when I was preparing the slides for today, I noticed that the process that this is mapping, which is about relating results of lab tests to patients, is actually the topic of a AHRQ toolkit that's just been released on improving lab test processes. So if you want to look at that toolkit, if you're interested in that particular process, we have a whole set of tools for you there. Next slide, please. Lyndee is now going to talk about using this tool, this module, with the VA.
So I think one of the things that also is important to note is at the beginning of the handbook, there's the very first step when a person, if they want to self-study or when we did it with our facilitators here, is there's a professional development plan. And so they go through a fairly extensive survey that they identify where they feel they have competencies and where they feel they need training, and then the pieces of the manual they can tailor to their particular learning needs. And with working with the VA, one of the areas that the internal coaches or practice facilitators there indicated that they had almost no experience was workflow mapping. So we took the module from the handbook and used it to train them, and there's a heavy emphasis on experiential learning and certainly adult learning theory in the training throughout the manual. In this particular instance, what happens in the session is, and this is a good one to do in person, although you can also do virtually, they get together and they map a common activity from memory. In this case, we had them map making a cell phone call. Surprising how complex that process actually is. And they did it from memory, did a map on that, and then mapped it again, observing directly their steps. And so one of the key lessons they learned from that process is that mapping from memory is difficult to do, and it's better to map from observation. So then we move on to teaching them more complex mapping processes using the swim lane mapping, because many clinical activities are not a single person at a single time or a single person across multiple times. It's usually multiple people across multiple times. And so if you could change slides. Next slide, please. Great. So here, the bottom one is a back one, please. The bottom one is an example of a swim lane, and you can see there that there's 3 big rows representing different roles, different people, and the activities going on, and then different temporal periods. are the columns across the top. And so the facilitators also learn to do that. They do it experientially and then move out into the field and train the teamlets using exactly the same training curriculum that they were just trained in. So there's some nice efficiencies in that the facilitators learn the training, go through it, and then they deliver the training out to the practice. Next slide, please. And one of the areas of emphasis that we also did in this module was having facilitators get comfortable mapping EHR clicks. A lot of workflow mapping in clinical settings at this point is also mapping EHR clicks and being able to create picture books of the EHR clicks for clinicians to use and know the functionalities of their EHR. So back to you, Cindy.
Thanks, Lyndee. So the third part of the toolkit we called In the Practice, because it's really about training facilitators. Can we have the next slide, please? Training facilitators to interact with the practices. And the module that we're going to highlight right now is the one on conducting a kickoff meeting. And you would think this is a relatively simple, straightforward activity that you wouldn't necessarily need a lot of training on. Next slide, please. But there are actually a lot of moving parts to conducting a kickoff meeting. So there's preparation to be done. You might want to do a little preliminary assessment. You need to think about what the goals are in the meeting, what the, scheduling people, so that very often you want to have some of the key leaders in the practice who, trying to get them all available at the same time. You might want to bring in an academic detailer who is usually a physician from another practice who can share their. I'm hearing a little background noise, so could people mute themselves if they're not me? The academic detailer can help sort of get them excited and get a can-do attitude from the very beginning. But the agenda has to be really tight because you don't have a lot of time with the individuals in the practice. They're taking away time from their patient care. And so the last thing in the module is to have the trainees conduct a little mock kickoff meeting to practice actually doing this. Lyndee, to you.
Okay, so the way that we use this in LANet and some of our lessons learned, one thing that we learned is that there are many, many good things that one can do in a practice. And so training facilitators to be, to have some discrimination, be able to focus themselves in the practice on those high impact, high yield activities, because the practice facilitators are a scarce resource. And so it's not possible to get to all issues, so they have to triage and prioritize those. And one of the ways that we use the training to help our facilitators stay focused and not, I call it, wander off into the poppies, is to teach them some what I call boldface. When pilots are being trained, they're taught certain things, like if there's an emergency in the plane, they have a boldface right there in the cockpit, step 1 through 10, and they learn it over and over again so it becomes automatic. And there's certain types of boldface activities that we trained our facilitators to do. For example, implementing guidelines. What are the steps you go through to do that? Another one is doing a kickoff meeting. And kickoff meetings are very critical to the start of an intervention with a practice, especially when it's the first time that they've worked with a facilitator. Practices typically don't understand what a practice facilitator is. They may try to think of them as like an audit and compliance person, which they are not. Or they may think of them as an external consultant, which they're not. And so there's a great deal of discussion that needs to happen so that the practice and its leadership understand what facilitators do and don't do and how best to use them. And so this training actually helps the facilitators create a script and memorize a script that describes what a practice facilitator does. Then they can go out in the field and they can adapt it or modify it if they need to, but it gives them something, especially if they're under pressure or they're feeling stressed, working with the practice at that moment, that it kind of gives them a bold face that they can fall back on. So the way that this module works is really very consistent with what Cindy just described, that the facilitators are taught the concepts and the important parts of a kickoff meeting. They learn to create not the final MOU, but an agreement with the practice that outlines the roles of the practice leadership, making sure the leadership stays engaged on a regular basis, and then working with the practice to define their goals for the intervention. And sometimes this is a weaving together of the practice's goals and the funder's goals, because sometimes, quite often, they're different. And so being able to map the two together, where you start where the practice begins, but are able to ultimately map it to the funder's needs. Am I missing anything on that, Cindy?
No, I think that looks good. You just have that nice picture to
the other piece is that they do the role play, and then they're able to go out and use it in the practice. The next slide, please, and I'll just show you a quick picture of what one of these kickoff sessions looks like. And I actually love this picture because to me it kind of shows that clash of worlds of the electronic and then still the residual paper. So back to you, Cindy.
Thanks, Lyndee. And I want to remind people that as we launch into the final component of the handbook, that you can start typing in your questions into your little question box, because we are going to have some time for a conversation at the end. So the fourth part, as I said before, is intervention specific, and we were focusing on implementing the care model in patient-centered medical home. So these are some of the tools that we felt were important for practice facilitators to be familiar with, and we are going to discuss in a little bit of detail now the 20th module, which is about facilitating panel management. Next slide, please. This is one of our longer modules. We asked trainees to spend about 75 minutes in preparation ahead of time. They've got some videos to watch, some reading to do, and then the session itself is 90 minutes. And that's because this is a pretty complex undertaking. Panel management is deciding which providers go with which patients. So you want to have somebody who's a primary care provider for each patient, and so they will have a panel of patients who they are responsible for their health and health care. So how large that panel should be, how do you decide who gets which patients, what kind of policies and procedures do you put in place that guide the selection of primary care providers, or how people move from panels, or all those sorts of things. And then once you've established the panels, how to monitor it to make sure that they don't get too large or other problems. And then the final piece of the module is an exercise where we actually have them in panel or assign to providers a set of mock patients. So Lyndee, tell us about it in the real world.
So next slide, please.
Next slide, please.
So with LANet, and I think with pretty much everybody right now working out in primary care to support improvement and transformation, kind of the golden fleece is the panel management and then ultimately the population management activities. But many of the practices that we work with, it's not that they don't understand the concepts. They sometimes have not been able to organize themselves well enough to assign roles and get the information systems and workflow systems in place to really do effective panel management and then also population management. And so what this module does is, again, I think this is the heart of the training for the facilitators, is it teaches them, gives them pretty deep exposure to different models of panel management, population management, some exemplar practices. We draw very heavily in the module off of the Safety Net Medical Home Initiative. Like we said, this curates some of the best of materials already out there. And so the facilitators complete a number of videos, a number of readings about panel management. And then Tom Bodenheimer and Amira Goreb at UCSF have developed a beautiful scripted training where you would be training an MA in how to do panel management. And it goes through topics like what is a registry, who is a panel management. It has a mock patient assignment to panel activity that the facilitators go through first as if they are the students. They assume roles like they're an MA or they're an RN or they're an administrator at the practice, and they complete this training. Then they take it out to the practice and deliver exactly the same training to the practice. There's group activities. For example, they set up they take a sample chronic care registry, and then the facilitators learn and then go teach the practices, how to analyze it, how many patients are in the panel, which patients have A1Cs, what does this mean, how often should they be measured. They teach this scripted curriculum teaches also, how to do the outreach process. How do you generate that report with the patient's name and their phone number and the different services they're needing so that that MA or whatever staff person's assigned can do that outreach. So it takes you really soup to nuts through kind of the core skills that you need to do panel management. And so our facilitators complete the training as if they're practice members, and then they take this scripted training out to the practices and train them. And then the final step, because we're always working on sustainability, and one of the things we found is there's a great deal of turnover in the practices. So somebody you trained 3 months ago may no longer be there. Is we leave behind that scripted curriculum and work with administration to include that in the new staff orientation materials and job description of a person that might be hired in the future into that role. So I think that is it for me. So back to you, Cindy.
Thanks. Well, we're going to go into our questions and answers. Could we have the next slide, please? And we've gotten several questions so far, but encouraging you to start typing in some more. And Rebecca is going to lead us through this segment.
So great. So thank you very much. A couple of questions have been posed about characteristics of folks who may serve as practice facilitators, particularly the importance of negotiation skills. And could you, I guess we'll start with Lyndee, could you please elaborate on the importance of negotiation skills, and maybe also when someone is being groomed within practices to take on the role of practice facilitator, how that role is balanced out with maybe some other responsibilities?
Okay, so the first question, Rebecca, would be around communication skills and how that's trained, and then the second would be what do you do when you have an internal facilitator as opposed to someone outside the organization?
Exactly.
Okay. So the communication skills, Joan had asked that question on the board, and I had been corresponding back with her. That is absolutely vital. That would go in that core competencies circle in that earlier diagram that looked like a kind of a squashed sphere. And one of the LA-NET, we're still looking for the best way to teach facilitators to do this well, because it's more complicated than just communication. There's also a process, some maturity in not getting triangulated and caught in some of the interpersonal dynamics in the practice. So I always talk about it's about personalities and it's about technologies. And so it's really about dealing with people and people issues, and then it's about dealing with the health IT systems. And the facilitators need to do both well. We have just started looking at some programs for LA-NET facilitators. One's called Crucial Conversations that teaches almost a bold-face approach to how do you communicate effectively around high-stress work issues. And so I don't know how well that's going to work because we just went through the training. I do know that we're planning to incorporate much more extensive materials in the future in the handbook around communication. It's something that's dealt with somewhat superficially, but not at the level of depth that will be needed for a fully trained practice facilitator.
And
so that's
Lyndee,
the question.
Let me jump in there too, because some of this gets to what can you train people and what do you need to select people for having. And when Lyndee was starting her demonstration project, we had conversations about sort of the criteria for hiring. And a lot of that discussion is in the how-to book as opposed to in the training modules. But Lyndee talked about, you know, there were some people who just seemed to shine and glitter and have that wherewithal interpersonally that you just can't teach somebody. So we don't make any pretense that that you can train somebody in some of the interpersonal behaviors that good facilitators exhibit. And I just want to use that also to sort of point out the distinctions between these two products, because they do get confused. So that the how-to book is really if you are wanting to launch a practice facilitation program. And so it talks a little bit about that hiring decision and what you're looking for when hiring people. But once they're hired, once you've decided on your raw material, then you're going to want to go to the training modules to make sure that they have the skill set that they need. And Lyndee, let's get back to you for the second half of that question.
So the second question dealt with how do you manage when it's someone inside the practice that's been assigned as the facilitator. And the major issue that we've seen with that is that there's so many competing demands within a practice that it's very hard to protect an internal staff person's time to do facilitation, especially if they have clinical duties, because the demand and urgency of the clinical is always going to trump that of practice improvement and transformation. So my bias is to try to find people that are supported by an external organization but get embedded within the practice. If it is somebody internally, they could go very easily through the same training. They could self-study even through this handbook. The two pieces that would be needed is that kind of being able to tap into the knowledge network of other practice facilitators is very important because of that spread of good ideas, exemplar practices. So that would be something that one would want to try to provide to someone that is a staff person within a practice developing these skills. And the other would be looking at modifications to their job description and also the way they're evaluated and their scheduling so that they have not only protected time to do this work, but it's also part of their job evaluation and their formal job description. So I don't know if that addresses the question.
And
well,
let me also jump in with another caveat around internal facilitation based on some demonstration grant programs that I work with. And this was in the public sector, time-limited grants. And so the thought was by one grantee, well, let's train people to be internal facilitators, and that will be sustaining because we know this grant money is going to run out and we're not going to have funds to keep the facilitation program running. But it turned out not to be quite as robust a solution as they would have hoped. Some because of the reasons Lyndee spoke of in terms of competing demands on that individual's time, but also because there's staff turnover. And so without having an infrastructure to train people continuously, it makes it a less attractive model for going forward in the future.
Could you, the question has come up, to what extent practice facilitators are used in primary care setting? Is that the predominant location that you're familiar with, or perhaps used in specialized settings?
Cindy, do you want to take that?
Well, I mean, Lyndee and my work have been pretty much exclusively in the primary care setting. And so if I were just off the top of my head thinking about what that might look like in a specialized setting, clearly there would be some carryover in terms of, those core competencies, but probably a larger proportion of specific skills that would need to be learned that were appropriate to that specialty site. So, and Lyndee, do you know of any specialty facilitation programs? Or
I don't. I mean, I think it would be very appropriate to apply in those settings. It's just not the area I'm working in.
Mm-hmm.
And with respect to how do you get the finances to support practice facilitators? Where do you get the funding to pay for them?
So LA-NET, the source of our funding predominantly has been AHRQ at this point, either through studies that they're conducting of practice facilitation and its effectiveness, or, for example, guideline implementation projects where we use facilitation for it. We're also getting funding. We've had a couple of direct pays from federally qualified health centers that wanted the facilitators to come in and help with PCMH transformation work. The vision that we have, though, is we would eventually like to be able to provide this resource to every safety net practice in LA, really as part of kind of one of these regional extension centers that's been discussed over the past few years, and that funding would come from probably the payer community in that region.
Yeah,
so we're working toward that vision.
Yeah, and let me speak to what little I know in terms of different funding models. So in some cases it has been a government-funded activity, so part of the Medicaid program, for example. In some cases there have been like an IPA that has funded facilitation for the practices in the IPA, or a health plan has been interested in providing those services. And in other places the funding gets patched together. So for example, I think in Arkansas the AHRQ, which are regional educational centers, they've had some money for facilitation around health information technology, and then they'll get another piece of funding to do another specific area, and they kind of put it all together to put their facilitation program to make it more comprehensive.
Cindy, there's some exciting models that are in certainly the impact states where they've been piloting statewide facilitation support is something to look toward. And then North Carolina, for example, at one point through their AHRQ, they had it built into their state budget, as did Vermont.
Right.
Other sites, state health departments may fund it. For example, Oklahoma ran a very robust facilitation program for their practices that saw a disproportionate share of high-risk patients that was funded through the state. And then some health plans, for example, Care Oregon and also the San Francisco Health Plan, both field their own practice facilitator workforces that go out into the practices that are serving their members. So there's a number of different funding models that are emerging for practice facilitation support. Some practices are doing it on the margin. They're cross-training a staff person that then provides that support to the practice until other funding resources become available.
And for wherever your resources come from to support the practice facilitator, how would you describe how one would demonstrate or measure whether the use of the practice facilitator has been successful?
You want me to start?
Do you want to take that one?
We could both take it.
You go first.
Well, very often there are specific goals, so that they're measuring, if they were trying to affect diabetes care, they'll look at the diabetes quality measures. They might look to patients' reports of care. If they were focusing on, improving their access, streamlining their patient flow and planned visits. So, usually there are some metrics built in to the practice facilitation. But Lyndee actually came up with some really interesting metrics for our demonstration project of having the facilitators assess the different phases that the practices were at in the process. Do you want to relate a little bit of that or some of the other measurement tools you used?
Yeah, I would say right now, to me, the most important, well, there's several. One is just exactly what you said, that they attain their goals, but also looking and making sure that the goals that eventually are the focus are ones that are going to have a high impact on patient outcomes and patient care. That doesn't mean you start there. One of my favorite stories comes from North Carolina, where the facilitator's first task was actually to try to get geese out of the parking lot. It was a very unique access issue, but that was where the practice was. That's what they were concerned with, and that's how you build that relationship and the ability to work with that practice. And so
we actually had that
was
problem at AHRQ.
Oh, you did?
Yeah,
wow.
when we first
so they did, but they used it as an opportunity to teach quality improvement processes and PDSA cycles and build relationships and get to know the staff, and they got the geese out of the parking lot, and then they moved on to other types of improvement. So that's
But Lyndee, one of the things that I was thinking about is, one of the things that when Lyndee was tracking the progress with the practices was we saw that it was not linear, that practices who seemed to have advanced to a certain stage sometimes fell back in the subsequent month and then, started moving ahead again. And I also want to make the point that looking at just sort of the goal measurement doesn't tell you about the infrastructure that you've created. So you really need to be asking, are the practices able to themselves, collect these data, run PDSA quality improvement cycles to test changes? Are they, sustaining things? So you do need to get beyond certainly clinical measures when you're assessing how well the facilitation went.
I think the other piece, and Cindy, you're absolutely right, a lot of it's also looking at first order versus second order versus third order outcomes. And so looking at whether a facilitation intervention resulted in patients with diabetics having better A1Cs is not the way to go because it's a third order outcome, right? You're looking at the facilitator's impact on processes. But the other piece, and it's become really important to me recently, is the sustainability of these changes, partly because we're having so much turnover in staff in the safety net right now that one of the things I'm starting to do a lot of thinking about with our facilitators is how do you plan for sustainability when you could predict that 30% of your staff may be gone in a year. And so that's one of the metrics I'm starting to look at is how do we get this built in so it happens automatically if, the registry director leaves or the CMO leaves. And so that's a new metric that's on my radar. I don't know quite how to tap that yet, but we care a lot about that at this point. Other questions, Rebecca?
I don't know that you would have the objective data, but has your general experience indicated for grant proposals that have addressed and include having practice facilitators as part of the research project that there's a certain advantage?
Can you say that again, Rebecca?
With respect to grant applications, do you find informally, is it recognized in the research community that there's a bit of an advantage in the overall merit of an application if you've already prepared for in your research design to have practice facilitators?
I think it depends on your review group, right? I think the concept of practice facilitators is still somewhat new. So if you have a review group that's well-versed in the use of practice facilitators, I think it certainly would be an advantage. But I don't know how many review groups right now have that level of sophistication or knowledge.
So it's still
in this area.
A new area to recognize that it could be advantageous.
And you need to educate the reviewers in your proposal, I think.
Okay. Could you please elaborate on whether there is synergism or overlap between the quality improvement organizations and a practice facilitator?
Well, I would think there'd be a great deal. I think quality improvement organizations are a very good home for practice facilitators, and they could also be a very good training resource for practice facilitation workforces that are located in other places. So I think there's a great deal of overlap. I think some of the maybe compliance issues, you have to really draw a pretty big line in the sand. It's to do good quality improvement, people have to feel safe and they have to feel respected and they have to feel comfortable looking at performance data and not worrying about being, somehow adversely impacted by it.
Right, which means there really needs to be a firewall between any, regulatory and evaluative functions and the facilitation.
The Qualis did they did a really nice job of developing training materials and supporting these kinds of workforces in that safety net initiative. I think Catherine Phillips is the person that helped lead that, and she would be a great resource for anybody. I noticed in the poll that we have a number of quality improvement organizations interested in this, and she would certainly be a great point of contact.
A new question, thank you. In your handbook or the guidebook, do you have any discussion about include any steps or practices who wish to become recognized as certified patient-centered medical homes? So any practice facilitation specifically for that?
Yeah, it doesn't specifically talk about the certification process, and you could be meaning NCQA, or you could mean Joint Commission, or there are a number of different processes out there. What it does include is some of the things, helping practices accomplish some of the things that they will need to address in obtaining certification, but it is by no means comprehensive on that score.
And that, Rebecca, was a pretty strategic decision too. One of the things that we recognized and realized, especially with the newer, at least for the NCQA, works a little bit better. But we found it actually pulled people off course, that it became more almost like a teach to the test type of activity than real practice transformation. That's less an issue now with the new kind of standards and structure. But in general, we subcontract that work out to other organizations when our practices need it. And I know there's several other facilitation groups across the country that do the same thing. Mainly, they find that it interferes with kind of looking big picture, long term at the practice, because you get very focused on completing and meeting the requirements of that application.
Thank you. There's several other questions. With respect to kind of how would one, you've gathered a lot of information in your two documents and the reports that are freely available, but how would one stay current and identify other groups who are engaged in practice facilitation for either recruiting practice facilitators if you're going to do research or quality improvement, or otherwise conferring about new strategies? How does one keep current or connect with other practice facilitators?
I'll give a plug to you guys.
Well, I'm going to hold you, Lyndee, because Bob's going to be talking about this. So let's put that off for another minute or two when Bob McNeilis will be joining us.
I won't steal it, but AHRQ is a great place to go, and he'll tell you more about that. Other questions, Rebecca, or are we getting close to?
There were several more detailed questions, and so what we can do for the more detailed questions, we can make note of them, and we know who posed those questions, and we can get back to them with your responses, if that's all right, because in the interest of time. I think that's how we'll proceed in the more nitty-gritty questions. I will ask you a more general question. So you guys have a real great commitment to practice facilitation. And when I posed the question, how do you fund practice facilitation, you could tell by the various resources that you've, and I mean this in a nice way, you've cobbled together in order to support and develop this area. What really drives you to continue and persevere when it is difficult to find funding and to get the training? And it's a really diverse group of challenges put forth. What really is driving you, Lyndee, out in the field and the PBRNs to proceed?
Well, I guess what's driving me is the hope and also belief that at some point there is going to be operational funding for this type of thing from either a governmental source or another payer group. It's certainly an idea that's gathering a great deal of momentum and a lot of interest. For example, there's a group that's formed in California called CAPC, California Advanced Primary Care Institute, that's really looking at how can they put together a statewide workforce of facilitators through partnerships with IPAs and then also with payer groups. And those groups appear to be interested in funding this workforce because the workforce has the capacity to improve outcomes and lower cost, really in pursuit of those triple aims. So, you know, it's kind of that long-term vision or hope that there will be a funding source for this, or we'll look a little bit like North Carolina or some of these groups that have been able to put state-level infrastructure in place and sustain it at least for a period of time. And then the other is it's just wonderful to be able to be helpful in the enterprise of caring for people. And of course, we work in the safety net, and we're very committed to the health and outcomes of low-income families in Los Angeles. And so being able to support the practices to do things that maybe they wouldn't have been able to do without that additional support and help that then translate into improved lives for our communities is pretty rewarding.
Thank you. With that, we'll bring in Bob McMillis to tell us about some current activities with respect to AHRQ and practice facilitation.
Great.
Bob?
Thanks, Rebecca. Everybody can hear me okay? Yeah. Well, I just want to wish my good afternoon to all, and thank you all for joining us today. As Rebecca said, I'm Bob McMillis. I'm AHRQ's Senior Advisor for Primary Care. And first, I'd like to give my thanks to Lyndee Knox and Cindy Brach for that wonderful presentation. It was a great review of the contents of the handbook and how it's going to be used. It's a fabulous resource for future practice facilitators and programs who train practice facilitators. But as good as it is, and it's really good, AHRQ is working on making it even more useful. We're developing a model curriculum that's based on the handbook and other resources that can be delivered in person or online. Our goal is to have a turnkey product that will include an instructor's guide, additional student materials, guidance on learning assessments, and all the supporting information needed to train excellent entry-level practice facilitators. You can look for the launch of that curriculum. I suspect, let me not overpromise, late 2014, probably closer to early 2015. So we have a lot of work to do yet. But in the handbook, in the meantime, is a fantastic resource to continue to use. But I just want to make sure that you understand the series of related projects really reinforces AHRQ's belief and based on really good evidence that practice facilitators are a critical component of helping improve quality in primary care practices in particular. And make sure we direct you for more information, and you can see on the slide here you can get many other AHRQ resources, including the how-to guide people asked about. I saw in some of the questions as well how to get the how-to guide, as well as other resources around the patient-centered medical home. There's case studies on how to use practice facilitators, all at the PCMH Resource Center. And the link is there on the slide, www.pcmh.ahrq.gov. And we also invite you to subscribe to our primary care practice facilitation e-newsletter. The email address to subscribe is there on the screen, practicefacilitation@mathematica-mpr.com. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And Rebecca, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Sorry, can I jump in here for a second, Bob? Because I noticed that a number of people had their hands raised, and we should have made it clear at the beginning of the webinar that all questions had to be submitted. That you didn't get a chance to ask, please go ahead.
That's right. Thank you for that excellent point, Cindy, and for the summary, Bob. So I'll make a commitment is in late 2014 or 2015, when that new reference is available, we will use the participant list of this presentation and send that out to you then, and I'm sure AHRQ will be quite effective in disseminating that material further. So I thank I thank our presenters, Lyndee and Cindy, for providing us thoughtful and very in-depth responses to the questions that we were able to articulate at the end of the session. And we will address the questions that were posed, more detailed questions, and get back to those folks who raise those questions the best we can in the next week or two. And Kristen is going to share with you the instructions for those clinicians who wish to receive CME credit for today, how you submit that request. And I thank you all for your time and detailed attention, and we look forward to a little bump in usage of both the handbook and the guide with respect to practice facilitation, and look forward to you joining us in future webinars. And I apologize for the technical glitches at the beginning. We'll be adjusting our workflow accordingly so it doesn't happen in the future. But thanks again very much to Cindy and Lyndee for their thoughtful presentations and their wonderful responses. And thank you for taking the time to answer our polling questions. That worked really well, and that helps me with respect to the other activities to support through the PBRN what interests folks who were on this call, and it's very helpful. Kristen?
Thanks, Rebecca. So this webinar has been reviewed and is acceptable for up to 1.25 credits from the AAFP. To obtain CME credit for participation in this webinar, please complete the online evaluation. You will be prompted to do this when you exit the webinar. And then you can email us at pbrn@abtassoc.com to request a copy of your CME Certificate of Participation. And Rebecca, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, so I'll put a plug in for our practice-based research network. If you care to join us, be on the list. It's really quite painless. You can send your name and your email and any affiliation you may have with the practice-based research network to the email address below, and we'll be glad to put you on our list. We have wonderful updates every 2 weeks. Even if you don't have a PBRN or affiliated with one but have general interest in primary care in particular, we have various activities that are relevant to primary care researchers and also primary care clinicians. So you're welcome to join us, and as instructed below. And with that, it's been an excellent 90 minutes, and I will say farewell, but you can come back and join us in December to hear Frances Laguerre give a wonderful presentation about theories underlying behavioral change. We had the pleasure of her giving a presentation last summer. It was quite lively, engaging, and another 90 minutes that can be very well spent. So we look forward to you joining us then if you're able. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.